Did you ever realize how we always talk about the Soviets dumping everything on the tactical level in close air support during World War II, but we never really talk about the question of why they do this? Yes? No? In any case, I'm going to be talking about that in this very video, and it is a video that is sponsored by you. Yes, you, the military aviation history community. The Soviet Air Force going into World War II was contradictory. On one side, the Soviets stressed army support on the front lines with close air support, and some light interdiction, of course, mixed into this. And beyond this, the Soviet Union also fielded strategic air units for much the same reason as other nations. So a mix of military doctrine, theory, assumptions, and quite frankly, national prestige. However, during World War II, though some limited strategic raids were conducted, the Soviet Air Forces, or the VVS, focused almost exclusively on close air support in support of ground combat operations. However, it is of course one thing to say that the Soviet Union focuses a lot on close air support, and an entirely different thing to look at their planning to try to understand what exactly they had in mind. If we do that, we move from sort of this abstract level of understanding to a more thorough understanding of the operational planning of the Soviet armed forces, and in many ways there's some legacy of this also nowadays in Russia. And that's what we're going to do exactly in this video. For this, we are jumping right back into the archives with a file I found in the German military archive. This is a German translation of a captured Soviet document from 1944 detailing the principles as well as the guidelines of air support. It is a fantastic, period-relevant deep dive into Soviet doctrine. Now, as it is a translation, let's consider the usual issues with such a source. Although I would say that this document does appear to be a very factual translation with no additional commentary, neither qualitative or ideological in nature, we do have to, of course, consider that certain nuances might be lost in that translation. And also, let's be honest, it would be in Germany's interest to get the translation right, because you want to know how the Soviets consider air support from the operational planning level over to its actual practical realization for their own sake. Let's talk about Soviet air support. I will put this into 4 chapters. First, I will talk about the operational guidelines and the prerequisites, very important. Second, I'll explain the difference between the 2 main forms of conducting air support by the Soviet Air Force. And then I'll go through an example of how this was to look like in a textbook fashion. And finally, I'll talk a bit about Soviet air support in practice. So, full 360 look at this topic. Are you excited? I am excited. Let's go through the basic guidelines that are to be followed when conducting air support. These boil down to 5 main points. So first, air and ground units must agree on the overall plan that is to be followed. And then subsequently, those units must then be clear on the plan and the tasks that both of them fulfill within this overall plan. So for the Air Forces means knowing and understanding their own as well as the Army's plan, and vice versa. And then the airfields and the forward operating bases must of course be in close proximity to supported Army troops. And then the Air Force must be in constant contact with Army troops it supports. And ground units must understand and use the correct ground signals to communicate with air units. These points are relatively standard, I would say, and you will also see them in similar documents, of course, with some minor variation in the margins that are written by, say, the Luftwaffe, the Army Air Force from America, the RAF, and so on. The Soviet Union, when it comes to close and operational air support, differentiates between 2 main forms of command when conducting the combat operations. These are caveat attached here, translated from Russian to German and now to English by me. So they're not going to roll off the tongue in the most eloquent manner. Let's just embrace it. But we have the operational cooperation with ground units through air support and the operational cooperation with ground units through subordination. The former is the main form of supporting the ground units during their operations. In this case, air support is centrally steered via an air army. An air army is the largest formation in the Soviet air forces, comprised out of multiple air divisions, for example, fighter, assault and bomber divisions, which are then in turn home to multiple air regiments. Though an air army operates generally independent from ground forces in terms of drawing up an operational plan and tasking orders, the commander of an air army is tasked, amongst all operational combat missions, to support the ground units. Thus, the overall parameters of the operation are given by the army to the Air Force, and the Air Force then draws up the particulars for their own involvement within this overall plan. Here we see the biggest difference to, for example, the Luftwaffe. While the Soviet Union steered operational air support at the army level, which is broadly similar to the German Luftwaffe, the Germans conducted air support mainly via the corps level, which is more or less similar to the Soviet divisional command level. A different type of operational air support is through direct subordination. This is done only for specific stages in the combat operation plan and is meant as a focus on the direct air support for mechanized and motorized units along the central axis of advance. Thereby, the air units are given tasking orders directly from the army command or the divisional level of command via liaison officers rather than through the air army. As such, we can see that while generally air support was directed via the air forces' own centralized command structure in order to support specific units or critical stages and critical areas in an operational plan, the Soviet armed forces were happy to subordinate air units also to ground units for such tasks based on overall requirements. One exception here is of course reconnaissance, which was generally tied, no big surprise here, closely in with the ground forces, and reconnaissance requests would generally come directly from the army to the relevant recon air units rather than going through the whole sort of command structure of the Air Force. This is in fact very similar to other air forces at the time, and the army quite rightly gets VIP status for close reconnaissance. It makes absolutely sense. What is also interesting is that the Soviet Air Force considered every possible free combat aircraft as a reconnaissance aircraft, and it didn't necessarily reserve specific aircraft or aircraft types just for this role. As we go into an example of Soviet air support, here's a word from today's sponsor, our own publishing house, which exists thanks to all of you. So really, you are the sponsors. We have a fantastic new book coming out, Achtung Tiger, How the Allies Defeated the Famous German Heavy Tank, by no other than the fantastic Peter Samsonov. It details the testing and development of counters to the Tiger tank from both the Soviet and Western Allied side. You can get it for 15% off during our 1-year anniversary sale when you buy it directly via the links in the description. This is the best time to pick it up. As a thank you for supporting us, we also have a further 10% off from all books in our catalog as our 1-year celebration. This includes also the Tank Assault Limited Edition, which will go off sale very soon, replaced by the regular edition. It is the perfect occasion to pick up some summertime reading and at a discount as well. Look, they are books. Books are awesome, and you don't need my marketing spiel for this. All of this is possible thanks to you. Check out the description, and now back to the video. To understand how the Soviet armed forces wanted to use air power in operations, let's look at a textbook example. In this example, based on this primary source, let us assume that the Soviet army wants to penetrate and break through a defensive line. Now, I'm going to be separating this into specific phases, following largely the chapters in the original documents, but to have a clean separation, I am going to give these phases my own titles. That's the preparation phase, the attack phase, and then the breakthrough phase. Again, those are my titles just to structure this, not the original source, but that's the only change. In the first steps, the army draws up the operational plan and the overall scope and targets of the operation. This includes the place and time of individual ground units and their movements and attacks. This is submitted then to the Air Force, and a support plan is drawn up cooperatively over a period of about 2 days, in which the main stages of the operation, the strength of the air component, and the appropriate air support, together with specific targets and tasks, is then drawn up. Air units are also moved to appropriate airfields if required. These should be about 15 to 40 kilometers from the front lines. Once this is completed, liaison officers are then stationed within the appropriate command posts of ground units to oversee the routing of information and air support. Ground units are instructed on the overall scope of the air operation during this time. This includes respective cooperation tasks, the flight routes of the Air Force, as well as signaling and communication directives, and then of course also the guidelines on ground-to-air communication on vectoring aircraft to the frontline targets. Air unit commanders are then briefed on the operational area as well as their tasks, and the crews are given maps and familiarization with the area. This may also involve familiarization flights in the area itself. Air unit commanders are then also tasked to visit the ground units that they will deliver air support to in order to clarify and formalize the specific elements of local ground and air cooperation. As well as that, the main part of the operation, so generally the initial airstrikes, are to be wargamed in order to identify any issues with the plan. Now let us move to the next phase, namely the attack. During the initial artillery barrage, air units are to then fly over the operational area, only through specific corridors and at predefined times. The guidelines even stipulate that if planes are to fly at lower altitudes than 1,000 meters, special attention has to be paid to the ballistic trajectory of the artillery, so that the flight of planes and the shells don't cross. I'm gonna be honest, that is not something I expected to read, but we all know how the Soviets and Russia likes artillery, a lot of artillery, so it does make sense. Actually, for recon units, I've heard this before already in other countries as well. Anyway, during this initial barrage, targets that cannot be engaged or observed by artillery are to be hit with air attacks. The exception are heavily fortified defensive lines, which are to be hit by both artillery and air attack more or less simultaneously. Then, just prior to the ground attack, artillery and air are to hit specific targets in front of the assaulting ground units simultaneously. To prevent friendly fire, friendly troops must mark their positions on the ground and not be closer than 200 meters to the front line, at least in theory. This opening attack is then flown by a specific number of aircraft so as to maintain enough aircraft for air support as the ground units advance on a rolling basis. Now, as the ground units advance, the attackers maintain their station until fighters arrive to cover the advance. This cover must be continuous for 2 to 3 hours to protect against enemy air attacks. At this point, the attacker aircraft start to then again focus on enemy tanks, artillery, infantry position, AT guns that will prevent the advance of friendly units. And this is when we shift into the next phase. As ground forces advance, small air units that fly independently from mission orders either attack out of their own initiative or are on call when ground units need them. This is a good example of how even in a centralized structure of the Soviet armed forces, we can find some flexibility and autonomy in mission orders when required. Likewise, air attacks continue on the front line to support second wave attacks. Special attention is paid here to the support of breakthrough and fast-moving ground units. Here, about 6 to 8 attacker-type aircraft, so IL-2s mainly, are specifically designated to support such ground units and attack defensive units and positions that are a threat to the ongoing advance. Because of constantly shifting front lines, ground units must mark their positions immediately upon spotting friendly aircraft, and they are instructed to continuously report their positions to the air units. Likewise, the air units start to shift to the wider battlefield area. This is done first by hitting retreating units and crucially reserves that are being rushed in by defending forces. And this is of course then done to prevent the enemy from rallying, reorganizing and redressing a new defensive line. Reconnaissance is considered key in order to identify such rallying and the preparation of enemy forces. Here we can see a main difference between, for example, the Soviet and Air Force and the Luftwaffe. and also the Western Air Force system for air support. The Soviet Union maintains a relatively strong focus on the front lines, even as it hits units that are not necessarily engaged in combat. While the document doesn't give you the average distance now here from the forward line of troops, we can generally consider this, based on a number of other sources, to be an area of 10, perhaps 15 to 20 kilometers max. The Luftwaffe and the Western allies would generally incorporate interdiction efforts beyond close air support in order to then cut off the battlefield area almost entirely, or at least this is the aspiration, which could be up to 50 to 100 kilometers away from the actual front line. The Soviets tried to do something very similar, but much closer to the front lines. Now, what have we learned? Overall, provided the translation is correct and didn't make any major mistakes, neither in the document or me reading my own native language. Plus, let's be conscious, of course, of the fact that textbook and real life is very different. This document does confirm the overall picture that we have of the Red Air Force during World War II. This is a very strong focus on that front line and a focus on temporary local air superiority instead of operational or theater-wide control of the air, and the use of air as a rolling and flexible delivery platform of firepower against targets that cannot be hit or not sufficiently hit by artillery, and it has to be in direct support of the main advancing ground thrust. That said, I think we also have much more of that. This document shows how closely air support was tied to the operational battle planning of the Red Army in 1944, and that really it is more than just hitting the front lines with a couple of rockets and a couple of bombs wherever you feel like it. There was a very top-down, methodical approach here that combines a lot of planning, tight organization, very heavily coordinated strikes with just enough flexibility, one might say, to provide on-call assistance within this system. And this system, as long as it isn't disrupted, builds and creates, yes, absolutely a very heavy-handed Soviet style of warfare. But specifically, due to its very methodical planning and heavy-handed approach that comes with it, it aims to build that coordinated momentum, and that underscores the ability of the Red Army to achieve and to maintain an offensive of shock-like depenetration operations by those heavily mechanized forces that it aims to do this with. And this is at odds, I would argue, with the typical popular image that we so often get, especially from popular products, of this mindless Soviet approach of just throwing enough stuff at the enemy in order to blindly overwhelm them. There is definitely something of that involved as well here, but it's much more coordinated and methodical, as popular products make us believe. Now, naturally, since then, the Soviet armed forces and then the Russian forces that absolutely still have that legacy, they changed and developed new tactics and equipment. But fundamentally, I would argue, if you look at the Russian military doctrine since the Cold War, and now also the stuff coming out from the Russia-Ukrainian war, I do think we see very similar ways of operational thinking, though of course they are changing and innovating here and there. If you want to deep dive a little bit more on sort of Russian military doctrine, I also highly recommend you checking out a recent video I did on the difference between NATO pilot training and Russian pilot training that maps out some of these things very nicely with the voice of independent experts as well. As always, I want to thank you, the community, for, well, sponsoring the channel, making all of this possible, from the archives over to the fact that we're now publishing books. A big thank you to all of you. You make it possible. A big thank you also to Andrew, as well as Bernhard Kass from Military History Visualized for his fire support. As always, have a great day and see you in the sky.